In November of 1984, a young mother sat across from a police officer in Red Bluff, California, and said something no one in that quiet Tehama County town was prepared to hear. She told Lieutenant Jerry Brown that her husband had been keeping a woman captive. Not for days, not for weeks, for 7 years. The woman had been locked inside a wooden box, kept under the same bed where this mother slept, fed her children breakfast, and lived what looked, from the outside, like an ordinary life. The mother's name was Janice Hooker. The woman she was describing was Colleen Stan, and the story she began to tell that day would eventually be called, by the psychologist who testified at trial, an experience without precedent in the recorded history of the FBI. Before there was a police report, before there was a trial, before the world knew the name Colleen Stan, there was a Thursday morning in May of 1977, and a young woman standing on the side of Interstate 5, thumb out, waiting for a safe ride. Before we go further, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments. This case unfolded along a stretch of California highway that thousands of people pass through every year without a second thought. Someone watching right now might have driven past Red Bluff without knowing what happened there. Colleen Stan was born on December 31, 1956, and raised in Eugene, Oregon. Public records confirm her hometown and her date of birth, but very little else about her early life has been documented in the sources available on this case. No school records, no employer histories, no family interviews describing her childhood in detail have surfaced in the research for this video. What is known comes largely from Colleen's own later accounts, given decades after her ordeal, in interviews with outlets including CBS News, People, and Oxygen. What those accounts consistently describe is a 20-year-old woman who considered herself an experienced hitchhiker. In an era before rideshares, before cell phones, hitchhiking along the West Coast was still a common way for young people to travel, and Colleen had done it before. She knew, or believed she knew, how to read a car before she got into it. On May 19, 1977, Colleen set out from her home in Eugene, planning to hitchhike to Westwood, California, where a friend was celebrating a birthday. It was a trip many young hitchhikers made in that decade without incident. Colleen would later recall that she turned down 2 rides before she reached Red Bluff. She was careful, deliberate, watching for the right car. When a blue van pulled over, she saw a young couple in the front seat and a baby in the back. A family. To Colleen, in that moment, a family felt safe. She got in. The driver was 23-year-old Cameron Hooker, a lumber mill worker. Beside him was his wife, Janice, who was 18 or 19 at the time, with their infant child. For the first stretch of the drive, nothing seemed wrong. At a gas station along the way, Colleen went to use the restroom, and by her own account, something in her hesitated. She has described a voice in her head telling her to run, to climb out a window and not look back. She didn't listen to it. She came back to the van. About 20 minutes past that stop, Cameron pulled off the highway. He told Colleen he wanted to show her some nearby caves. Janice got out of the van with the baby and walked down toward a lake, and by Colleen's account, they appeared to be playing together, ordinary and unhurried. It was in that moment, with his wife and child a short distance away, that Cameron climbed into the back seat, held a knife to Colleen's throat, tied her hands, and placed a wooden box over her head. That box, built specifically to block out light, sound, and air, would become the defining image of the next 7 years of Colleen Stan's life. She was taken to the Hooker's home in Red Bluff. On the first night of her captivity, according to court testimony and multiple corroborating accounts, Colleen was strung up by her wrists, physically assaulted, and left blindfolded and suspended while Cameron and Janice had sex beneath her. It was the beginning of what prosecutors would later argue was a calculated campaign of psychological and physical control, one that Cameron and Janice had discussed and agreed to before Colleen was ever taken. According to testimony from the case, the couple had reached an understanding that Cameron would find someone to take Janice's place in fulfilling his interest in bondage, and that penetrative sex with the captive would not be part of the arrangement. That boundary did not hold. In January of 1978, Colleen was presented with what has been described in court records and reporting as a master-slave contract, and under threat, she signed it. From that point forward, according to her later testimony, she was referred to only as K, was required to call Cameron Master, and was told she was not permitted to speak without his permission. This video will not describe the physical and sexual abuse that followed in graphic detail. Court records establish that Colleen endured repeated rape and torture over years of captivity, and that is the fact this story is built around, not something this channel will dwell on further. Central to Cameron's control over Colleen was a fiction he built and maintained for years. The idea of a vast, powerful organization called The Company, which he told her was monitoring her every move, and which would torture her and harm her family if she ever tried to escape or tell anyone what was happening. Colleen has said in interviews that her fear of the company, reinforced by Cameron almost daily, was what kept her compliant, even in moments when escape might have seemed possible. Now that you know a little about who Colleen was, a careful young woman, cautious enough to turn down 2 rides before accepting a third, does her story remind you of anyone in your own life? Tell me in the comments. Remembering the person she was before this happened is part of how we keep her story from being reduced to just a case file. There was, in the traditional sense, no investigation into Colleen Stan's disappearance, because for years, almost no one knew she was missing at all. She had left home to hitchhike to a party. Her family in Eugene had no reason to immediately suspect foul play, and no official missing person case appears to have driven the kind of law enforcement search that defines most cold cases on this channel. That absence is, in its own way, one of the most disturbing parts of this story. Colleen Stan was not lost in a system that failed to find her. She was hidden inside an ordinary home, a few miles off a major interstate, by 2 people who lived otherwise unremarkable lives in their community. The Hooker family eventually moved to a mobile home in Red Bluff, and it was there that Colleen was kept locked in wooden boxes built to fit beneath the couple's waterbed. In 1978, Janice gave birth to a second child on that same bed, with Colleen confined in the space below. According to Colleen's later testimony, over time, and only as a means of avoiding further punishment, she was gradually given small freedoms: permission to jog, to work in the yard, to help care for the Hooker children in the home. She has said she even helped Cameron construct larger, more elaborate spaces, including an underground space investigators later described as designed to hold additional captives. Even with an unlocked door, neighbors nearby, and access to a telephone, Colleen made no attempt to escape during this period. She has attributed this directly to her fear of the company, a fear that had been built, deliberately and methodically, over years of psychological conditioning. Investigators would later describe this case as unlike anything documented before in FBI history, a captivity sustained not just by physical restraint, but by a fabricated threat that kept a victim from walking out an open door. What do you think allowed that fear to hold for so long? Drop your theory in the comments. In 1981, Colleen was permitted to visit her family in Oregon on her own. She did not tell them what was happening to her. Her parents, according to reporting on the case, noticed that her clothes were homemade, that she had no money, and that years had passed with almost no contact, and they came to believe she had joined a cult. Fearing that pressuring her would drive her away permanently, they didn't push. She visited a second time the next day, with Cameron posing as her boyfriend, and the family took a photograph of the 2 of them together, smiling. At trial, Colleen would explain that she had genuinely been glad, in that moment, to see her parents, even while living a life they could not have imagined. After those visits, Cameron reportedly grew concerned that he had allowed Colleen too much freedom. He took her back to the mobile home and returned her to the box beneath the waterbed, where she would remain confined roughly 23 hours a day for the next 3 years. During that period, she managed basic bodily functions using a bedpan she positioned with her feet, and ate whatever scraps she was given. According to court testimony, the Hooker children were told that Kay had gone home. Only after they were asleep at night would Cameron remove Colleen from the box. For years, Colleen's own family believed she had disappeared into a cult. Never knowing the truth was so much closer and so much darker. If you've ever waited without answers for someone you loved, even in a very different circumstance, I want to hear about it in the comments. That kind of waiting deserves to be acknowledged. It was not until 1983 that Colleen was reintroduced to the Hooker children and to neighbors, and was allowed to take a job as a motel maid. By this point, 7 years into what had begun as a random encounter along Interstate 5, something inside the dynamic between Cameron and Janice had started to shift. Cameron began telling Janice that he wanted to make Colleen his second wife. For Janice, according to her own later testimony, that was the turning point. Janice testified that her own relationship with Cameron had, from their very first date, involved being tortured and manipulated by him as well, that she had endured years of being hung from trees and whipped, called degrading names, and worn down until she coped by compartmentalizing what was happening to her, treating pieces of her own life as though they belonged to someone else. It is worth being direct here. The prosecution's case, and Janice's own account, describe her as both complicit in Colleen's captivity and, by her telling, a victim of Cameron's control herself. Janice was ultimately granted full immunity from prosecution in exchange for her testimony against her husband, a decision made by prosecutors, not a verdict on the truth of her account, which the court accepted as part of the case against Cameron. By August of 1984, that shift in Janice reached a breaking point. She went to Colleen and told her, for the first time, that Cameron was not actually part of any organization called The Company, though Janice maintained, even then, that some version of the group existed. It was enough. Colleen made her way to a bus station and called Cameron to tell him she was leaving. According to her own account, he broke down crying on the phone. She got on a bus home to Oregon. We're about to reach the moment this 7-year captivity finally broke open, not through a police raid, but through a phone call from inside the Hooker house itself. What do you think finally pushed things past the point of no return? Drop your guess before you keep watching. Even after leaving, Colleen did not immediately go to the police. For several months afterward, she continued to call Cameron periodically. She would later explain at trial that she did this at Janice's request, to give him what Janice hoped might be a chance to change. It was Janice, not Colleen, who ultimately went to law enforcement. 3 months after Colleen's escape, in November of 1984, Janice sat down with Lieutenant Jerry Brown of the Red Bluff Police Department and told him what her husband had done. What she revealed went beyond Colleen Stan. Janice told police that Cameron had, in January of 1976, more than a year before Colleen was taken, kidnapped, tortured, and killed a 19-year-old woman named Marie Elizabeth Spanhake, who had gone missing from Chico, California. According to Janice's account, she and Cameron had picked Marie up while she was walking, brought her back to their home, hung her by her wrists in the basement, and tortured her over the course of a day before Cameron shot her with a pellet gun and strangled her. The couple, per Janice's statement, wrapped the body in blankets and buried it near Lassen Volcanic National Park. Authorities searched, but were never able to locate any remains, and because of that lack of physical evidence, no murder charge was ever filed in connection with Marie Spanhake's disappearance. This detail comes from Janice Hooker's testimony alone, without physical corroboration, and this video presents it with that qualification rather than as an established fact of conviction. Cameron Hooker was arrested in connection with Colleen Stan's kidnapping and the crimes committed against her. Forensic psychologist and criminal profiler Chris Hatcher testified for the prosecution, helping the court understand the mechanisms of coercive control that had kept Colleen compliant for so long. Testimony that would later be cited by legal scholars as foundational in cases involving prolonged captivity and psychological domination. Cameron went to trial on September 24, 1985, in San Mateo County Superior Court, before Judge Clarence B. Knight, after the case was moved out of Tehama County due to pretrial publicity. He faced 16 felony counts, including kidnapping with a special allegation of using a knife, 7 counts of rape, forced oral copulation, forced penetration with a foreign object, forced sodomy, false imprisonment, and abduction to live in an illicit relationship. At trial, Cameron's defense argued that Colleen had been a willing participant, pointing to the fact that she was not always physically chained, that she had been allowed to visit her family, and that she had, at times, moved freely around the community. The prosecution countered that what looked like freedom was in fact the product of years of calculated psychological control, consistent with what is now understood about coercive captivity and trauma bonding. The jury deliberated for days. At one point, they reported being deadlocked on a single count, but solid on the rest. On October 31, 1985, Halloween, the jury returned its verdict. Cameron Hooker was found guilty on 10 felony counts, including kidnapping, rape, and multiple sex offenses. He showed no visible emotion as the verdict was read. On November 22, 1985, Judge Knight sentenced Cameron Hooker to consecutive terms totaling 104 years in prison. In pronouncing sentence, the judge stated that Hooker was, in his words, the most dangerous psychopath he had ever encountered, and that he would remain a danger to women for as long as he was alive. After the sentencing, Colleen told reporters that seeing Cameron permanently unable to hurt anyone else had been her primary motivation for going through the ordeal of a public trial at all. If this story has stayed with you this far, it's worth sitting with what it took for this to come to light at all. Not a break in an investigation, but a decision made inside the house where it happened. Every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth. In the years that followed, Colleen Stan worked to rebuild a life. She studied for and earned a degree in accounting. She went into therapy. She also became a volunteer with the Redding Women's Refuge Center, an organization supporting survivors of abuse, turning what had been done to her into work that helped other women. Reporting on her later life, including a widely cited account in the New York Daily News, describes a path that was not simple, a string of failed marriages, and, according to that same reporting, a troubled child who was later incarcerated. Colleen has since changed her last name and, according to available reporting, continues to live in California. Janice, for her part, reverted to her maiden name, Lashley, went on to become a registered associate social worker, and has worked in mental health. Cameron Hooker's sentence was originally structured to keep him ineligible for parole until 2023. A change in California law concerning elderly incarcerated individuals moved his first parole hearing up to 2015, at which his request was denied. In 2020, state officials informed Colleen that Hooker could again become eligible for parole the following year, this time due to accumulated good conduct credit under updated sentencing law, a development that drew public opposition from local law enforcement in Tehama County. Colleen has been outspoken in her opposition to his release, telling a local California news outlet in 2021 that she did not want him back in the world, describing him simply as, in her words, an evil person. Rather than being released outright, Hooker was granted parole to the custody of the California Department of State Hospitals, where he has remained, while prosecutors in Tehama County pursue a legal designation that would classify him as a sexually violent predator, a status that, if granted, would mean indefinite commitment to a mental health facility rather than release, and would keep him permanently ineligible for parole. That proceeding has faced repeated delays over several years. As of this recording, jury selection in that trial began in May of 2026, with the proceeding expected to last approximately 4 weeks. The outcome, as of this video's production, remains pending. Colleen Stan's case did not stay confined to a courtroom in San Mateo County. It became the basis for the prosecutor-authored book, Perfect Victim, published in 1989, and a later account, Colleen Stan, The Simple Gifts of Life, published in 2009. It inspired a 2016 Lifetime television film, Girl in the Box, and a companion documentary of the same era. It has been referenced or fictionalized across true crime television, including episodes of Law and Order, Special Victims Unit, Criminal Minds, and Ghost Whisperer, and cited by musicians and novelists in the decades since. Its central, chilling mechanism, an invisible, fabricated threat used to keep a victim from walking out an unlocked door, has become a reference point in how psychologists and investigators talk about coercive control more broadly. But before any of that, before the books, before the television movies, before the case became something studied and referenced and fictionalized, it was simply a 20-year-old woman standing at the side of a California highway, trying to get to a friend's birthday party, and trusting a family with a baby in the back seat. The silent evidence tells the stories of real cases that deserve to be heard. Every case is researched from verified sources and presented with respect for the people who lived it. If this story affected you, consider learning more through the sources linked in the description below. Every case deserves an answer. Every family deserves the truth.